entitled this talk just a collective opportunity to respond well, because I do feel like this is a collective responsibility, and it is something that impacts us all. Um, what, uh, what I also do is I have a small-time private practice with Glenora registered psychologists, and so for about the last 5 years, there's been an increasing number of teens and adults that I've been seeing in my practice. So it comes my perspectives come about not just from the experience of being the director, but also from walking alongside the journey of many of these folks in their mental health experience. So I've got three general objectives that I want to walk through. The first is just becoming familiar with what we mean when we're talking about mental health. The second is embedding this learning within the broader experience of COVID-19, and I really appreciate Dr. Nicholas's presentation on this, because he really set the big picture in terms of some of the common experiences and challenges that people are having around mental health within the pandemic. And then finally integrating some of those definitions within the lives of autistic individuals, and looking really at where we're doing a really good job and where we have room to grow in terms of broader valuing of autistics in society at large. So wanted to just begin with looking at a few studies. So this was a commentary piece by Ames back in 2020, where they and their colleagues anticipated some of the potential distresses and also opportunities that were coming down the pipe in anticipation of the pandemic. And so some of the distresses they identified were things, so they were looking mostly at the child-focused lens, but they looked at things like, the impact on schedules for children and families, the negative impact on routines that had been well established perhaps over months and years, the loss of access to services for families or having really modified accessibilities, closing or disruption in their schools and their academic programming, health impacts in terms of reduced access to recreational opportunities and activities, and then overall just general heightened family distress because of fears and worries around the pandemic and potential socioeconomic distress. Certainly, just looking at this from the lens of the center, we have seen this up front and personal with lots of families. So we know that lots of our families did have tremendous impacts on their schedules and their routines. And for many of their children, this was highly disruptive and difficult for them to navigate. A lot of the young kids with autism, not everyone, but many of them use routines and schedules to self-regulate, to have this measure of predictability in their life. And the families rely on that as well. And one of the side effects of the pandemic is every week started to look different, and a lot of those routines were dropped with little or no notice. Getting a call. We have parents, who are getting a call from the school the morning of that basically their classroom was being closed because somebody had been identified as being a close contact of somebody with COVID, and their child could no longer come to school, and then they're scrambling to figure out how to support their child's learning in that home environment. We also had many parents that were balancing working from home with also caring for their children simultaneously and trying to be involved, and that created a lot of additional distress. And we had families that were facing unemployment or threatened unemployment because of the pandemic. And so all these distresses certainly built up, and I think amplify the system, amplify the underlying distress systems for both the children and the families. Now, there were also opportunities that emerged, and Ames talked about those. This is always a chance to sort of reflect and step back and look at the way we've been doing things in terms of our support models. And one of the benefits we really saw emerge is the rapid adoption and embracing of telehealth models of support, things like Zoom and so forth. As Dr. Nicholas mentioned, this particular technology doesn't necessarily work for every child and every family, and is not necessarily a replacement, but it does augment. And we have seen some families that really actually like this model of support, where they can access their teams um, and various professionals without having to leave the confines of their home. And we've also seen some increased access opportunities for families that are in different parts of the province, outside of the major urban centers, that are now able to participate and access mental health professionals, groups, and so forth, whereas before those weren't available in an online format. So there have been some positive developments. This is another survey that came out by Grumet et al. This was now, we're into the pandemic, and they surveyed 84 caregivers of children with neurodevelopmental support needs and asked them a whole range of questions around what their stress and worries might be at this time. And the major concern that came out from the caregiver community was they were really concerned that their children were losing access to rehabilitation supports for their children. And this again is something that is an anxiety and a worry and a concern that we have heard from lots of caregivers, where they were previously getting access to things like recreation opportunities or interventionists in their home, or respite and so forth. And all of a sudden, these supports just were not available, or they were only available in a highly modified format. And there were concerns about the effectiveness or efficacy or impact of those supports on their children's learning needs. We know in the school systems in particular, some of the kids, they just didn't have the same kinds of learning opportunities that they would have had previously, because of the modifications that were required because of the regulations around COVID. And then they also, from this survey, it became quite clear that caregivers were displaying higher levels of anxiety and depressive symptoms, and that this was really intimately related to their levels of perceived stress. And this was at a much higher level than the general population. Another quick survey. So this was done by a group out of Europe, which is always good to get more of an international perspective. So here they surveyed 1,000 adults with autism across 3 countries, so the UK, the Netherlands, and Belgium. And again, seeing increases in depression and anxiety related symptoms related to COVID. And again, this was across both autistic and non-autistic communities, but it was greater for the adults with autism than the neurotypical population. And the worries varied greatly. They showed increases in worries about their pets, about accessing work, getting medication and food. They worried about their own safety and security, particularly around potential exposure to COVID. They worried about things like cancellations and interruptions to their routines. Now, what I also liked about this study is, and Dr. Nicholas referenced this in some of his literature, is that some autistic adults actually found some silver linings in the pandemic. So some of the social stressors were reduced, the perception of those social stressors. So maybe working from home for some of these autistic adults was actually a better experience than having to go into the office and deal with all of the social distresses at work. They also noted that some adults with autism found that they didn't mind some of the increases in solidarity and some of the sensory and social overload challenges they were experiencing, navigating society at large, kind of tamped down a bit in this pandemic, and they experienced that as a positive. So again, it's important to recognize these are broad stats, and we have to interpret them in a way that they don't speak to every single individual in every individual circumstance, um, and there are wide ranges of response. So I want to switch gears a little bit and just talk about what we mean when we're talking about mental health. The Health Organization has some excellent materials that you could Google if you're interested. But I wanted to highlight a few quotes from one of their key publications, and really that it's mental health is more than the absence of mental disorders. And I really want to emphasize that, that it's not just about not having anxiety and not having depression. It's about a quality of life and a quality of experience in your life where you feel optimistic and happy and healthy. Um, Secondly, it's an integral part of health, and there is no health without mental health. I think we often compartmentalize these things, and we talk about mental health and physical health being different activities or constructs, and we have to stop doing that. They are integrated, and they are one and the same. If you are physically feeling unhealthy, you are probably mentally feeling unhealthy, um, and conversely, and both of those are you know um, deeply intertwined. Thirdly, we know that mental health is not a siloed construct with just one cause or one contribution, but it comes from a range of socioeconomic, biological, and environmental factors. And we need to keep all of that in the back of our minds when we're talking about mental health. And I'm going to speak more about that in a moment. And then finally, we do have many, many, many cost-effective public health and intersectoral strategies and interventions that exist to promote, protect, and restore mental health. And we need to tap into those, and we need to amplify those. So I'm just going to minimize this a little sec because I wanted to do a little exercise here. Now I got to go back to this. Um, how do I do this? I'm going to just stop sharing a quick moment. So I'm going to bring up the chat, and I just want to quickly ask, when you think about mental health and mental wellness, can you just type a few words into the chat, and I'll read some of them out as they come up.
Perhaps, Dr. Stoll, could you repeat that question one more time?
Sure. So as you think about mental health and mental wellness, can you just tap in a few words into the chat about what it means for you? I see ease, I see happiness, resilience, balance, stability, managing life, relaxation, support groups, exercise, taking time for yourself, meditating, activity, comfortability, balance, nutritious meals, yes, quiet, calm, having choices and able to control life, thriving. I really like that one, thriving. Okay, I'm going to just thank you so much for that. It really shows how what we mean by mental health is so broad. Okay, let me just reshare this again. Okay, there we go. So in psychology, we often talk about what's called a biopsychosocial model of mental health care. And the World Health Organization references this a little bit. Um, and so what this really means is that when we talk about mental health, there's no single contribution, but it's really the end result of a whole array of activities and attitudes and environmental factors that make up how we feel in this particular moment. So if we look at the biological factors and just start there, I mean, things like physical health, neurochemistry, genetic vulnerability, our own immune and stress response, other comorbidities we may be dealing with, our, metabolism, drug effects, diet, lifestyle, our learned history of rewards and emotions. I mean, these all contribute to our general sense of wellness. In my own practice, I often emphasize the physical wellness part, about eating well, sleeping well, getting moderate exercise is just base ways of approaching mental health in a positive way. In the psychological realm, I mean, again, we have a whole array and approaches and ways to talk about mental well-being and mental health. So self-esteem, how valuable do we see ourselves? What are our attitudes and beliefs about our place in the world and how we're doing? What are our coping skills? What are our perceptions of who we are and who our friends are and what our support systems look like? What's our personality and our temperament? Do we have the social skills to navigate the world we need to engage with? What kind of interpersonal relationships do we have? What's our history with trauma or grief? Um, Socially and environmentally, if we're dealing with issues of poverty or we don't have access to the resources we need to get food on the table, or our rent is due and we don't have a job to pay for that rent, that's going to contribute to our mental health. Do we, what's our family situation like? What's our experience of family? What's our cultural setting? How are our work and our schools structured? Are they structured in a way that optimizes our well-being and assets and looking into our abilities and our skills? Or do we feel devalued or minimized in those settings? And what are our peer groups? Um, so, I mean, this can seem a little bit overwhelming when you start to look at it all. But what I really like about this is I think it shows that you know you can intervene in a positive way for mental health in any one of these areas. We don't have to be thinking just about therapy as a mental health as a way of improving mental health. Any one of these approaches or pieces can make a positive contribution to our own experience. Particular to autism, I just wanted to speak briefly about some vulnerabilities that we know exist in the literature, and what I mean by this is that when we compare individuals with autism to the neurotypical population, we know there are certain health, behavioral, and medical underlying conditions that show up with more prevalence in this particular community. And so it's just important to keep that in mind, because if you for example are experiencing additional gastrointestinal distress, or you're already predisposed to anxiety, or you're having difficulties with self-regulation, or you're having difficulties already with language expression or understanding your world, all of these things only amplify, what we're experiencing right now in COVID, and can make it more challenging. So let's jump to the WHO definition. Mental health, it's a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to his or her own community. So let's start with the first one. Realizing your own abilities, so pivotal, right, to positive mental health. And I think this comes out of so many of these other factors, right? What's our experience in our school history, our relational history, our work history? What are the family and community values in which we're embedded, and how have our own abilities been either identified and rewarded and amplified, or minimized and maybe ignored or put down? What's our perception of success or failure around our own abilities? What is our sense of self-efficacy, which is the belief that we can meet the demands that we're faced with in a positive fashion? just reflecting a bit on particularly my interactions with adults with autism, I think they've often identified that there can be a lack of congruence with what is of value to an autistic person versus a neurotypical society. And if not managed well, that can lead to feelings of perceived failure or um, perceived, lesser value. So context and history is just really important in terms of recognizing and realizing everybody's own abilities. Can cope with the normal stresses of life. Um, so I found this little cartoon online. I hope you enjoy it. I think this is often our perception, right? That our resources and our demands are out of balance and that demands far exceed our resources. This sort of model of approaching stress comes out of this classic model, which was done by Lazarus and Folkman way back in the early 80s. They published on this. And they identified stress and our stress responses as kind of a dynamic process, um, which begins with our appraisal of the stressful situation in which we're embedded. So that's the primary appraisal process. And really it's about us identifying, is this encounter we're facing, is it a threat? Is it a challenge? Or is it benign? And so an example can be, me losing my job or me doing poorly in an examination at school. How am I perceiving that how am I appraising that experience? Am I encountering it as a threat, which is, something that's going to harm my well-being? Is it a challenge? And am I seeing it as like, I just need to step up a little more. This is a learning experience. Or do I just disregard it altogether and say, this doesn't have anything to do with me? Because that really informs our secondary appraisal process, which is what can I do about this encounter? How do I respond? Um, because if I see it as a threat, I'm going to respond quite differently than if I see it as a challenge. And then that's really informed by our history and our coping strategies. So if we've got a well-developed repertoire of coping strategies, we've dealt with lots of stressful situations in the past, and we've managed those stressful situations successfully, then we're likely to have a low psychophysiological reaction to that stressful experience. However, if our experience has been the other direction, that we often feel overwhelmed and that we don't have the resources, then our psychophysiological reaction is going to be much higher, and we're going to have a feeling of being overwhelmed. Can work productively. Here we know there's a well-established literature that as a society, we can do much better for the autistic community. There's various reports, but generally the accepted consensus is that anywhere up to 80% of individuals with autism are either under or unemployed. And that's a tragedy. And so this I think is a key contributor to the broader scope of mental health, because we all need meaningful activities, and we need to feel like we're contributing members in whatever way that looks like. We also need to have better systems for matching person environment fit for career success. We know that if you have a particular skill set, temperament, attitude, approach to problem solving, and that's not valued in your work environment or your school environment, there's a high probability that you're not going to succeed or have a lesser likelihood of success in that environment. And then finally, able to make a contribution to his or her community. To me, this really comes down to a sense of belonging, a sense of fitting in within a broader social dynamic, needing to have a space and a place, needing to feel accepted and celebrated. And again, I think here we've got room to grow as a broader community and society in terms of valuing autistic voice and choice, and making sure that everybody does feel like they belong. This is a common theme from those adults that I meet with in my private practice, where they often feel ostracized or outside of the community somehow, and they struggle to find a way in. to find a community, and this is really impacting their sense of belonging, and then ultimately their sense of well-being and mental health. So it's something we need to pay attention to. So I just wanted to end off really by talking a little bit about, if there are mental health concerns, what do you do? And how should you approach? I always start by saying, you really should talk to your family doctor first, and rule out whether there's anything physical going on in your body. This often gets overlooked in the process, and people jump to the assumption that this may not be the concern. But I have seen individuals, they've got other conditions, metabolic disorders, or their diet is insufficient and they don't have proper nutrients. There are other things contributing to their overall feeling of fatigue and well-being that need to be addressed and need to be addressed medically. And so it's always important to talk to your doctor first. And then talk to service providers and advocacy organizations. I mean, Dr. Nicholas mentioned the center where I work, but Autism Society of Edmonton and area, they have a huge array of different support networks that they can access or refer you to. I think it's important to reach out to both publicly and privately funded resources. Mental health is a real hodgepodge. You can have mental health resources that are funded through the municipality, the province, in the universities. You may have access to student mental health, and it's important to look at all of those options depending on your particular context. I'm a psychologist. Our association does maintain a referral line for individuals that you can access free of charge. Psychologists do have to pay to be on that list, so you won't get every psychologist, but they maintain a list at the Psychologist Association website. There's also a national registry of psychologists, the Canadian Health Register, that you can access free for referrals. So really, just in summary, I mean, we talked about a few definitions of mental health. We talked about the impact of COVID on caregivers, children, and autistic adults. Introduced you to a broader biopsychosocial framework. And then I'm really wanting to leave this presentation just with the sense that mental health is a mutual responsibility and something we need to do together in terms of our response. And then here's my contact information. If you do have any questions or comments or concerns about the presentation, I'd love to hear them, and we can talk further. I do think we have a few minutes left for some questions. So I'll just stop sharing a moment